In this video, we're going to learn how to install Istio Service Mesh in a Kubernetes cluster. First, we will install Istio core in the cluster, the main Istio component. Then we will install Istio Addons for monitoring and tracing. After that, we will configure our cluster so that Istio can automatically inject Envoy proxies in our application pods. And finally, we will deploy an example demo microservices application in the cluster so that we can see all the features and visualization for those microservices in Istio. And for this demonstration, we're going to use a local Minikube cluster. So let's jump right in. Now, if you want to learn what Istio is and what it's used for, you can watch my other video about it where I explain what Service Mesh is and what Istio is and all of its use cases. And then you can come back and learn the setup of Istio in your Kubernetes cluster. So the first thing we need to do is create or start our Minikube cluster. And one note here is that Istio will actually need some resources, so the default resources that Minikube cluster gets created with will not be enough. So in the Minikube start command, we're going to provide options to increase the CPU and memory resources that our Minikube cluster gets. And this resource configuration should be now enough for our demonstration. So make sure to set those resources high, and we're going to start a Minikube cluster. So now that we have our Minikube cluster running with enough resources, we can actually install Istio. And the first thing to installing Istio is to download Istio release package locally on our computer. And on Istio's official documentation page, actually, you have a guide to installing Istio, and in this guide we have a link to Istio releases. You can also download the latest Istio release for your specific operating system using this command here, but we're going to do this using this Istio release link. And here you have all the releases. We're going to install the latest one. And I'm using Mac, so that's what I'm going to download. Make sure to download the one for your operating system. And as you see, this is a tar file. So basically we just unpack it or untar it and we'll see what's inside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder in my home directory. I'm going to call it Istio installation. And I'm going to move that downloaded Istio tar file to that folder. Like this. And let's go to Istio installation, and right here is our tar file. So that's the Istio installation folder, and here we have the tar file. I'm just gonna double click and unpack it, and let's actually see what's inside. We have the executable, the Istio binary folder, and some other files. And what we're gonna need from Istio is actually an Istio control command line, which is in this binary folder. And we want that command line tool to be executable. And right now, if I do Istioctl and execute, you see the command not found. So we need that command, which is here in the binary folder. So in order to make that command available, we're going to add it to a path, right? To executable path. And we can do that by adding the path to this binary folder to our path, right? Basically appending it. So right now, this is how my path looks like this. And basically here we just want to append the path to this folder here. Let's actually find out what the path is. I'm gonna go inside that Istio folder like this. And I'm gonna print out the path. That's it, this whole thing here. And now we can append that to the path variable. Right? So we have the original one, the path, and separator, and we're just gonna add this one here, /bin, and there you go. I'm gonna execute it, and now if I do Istioctl and execute, there you go. So we have Istioctl available, or Istio control command line interface available here because we set the path. Now, just note that this only sets that path or appends that executable only in this terminal. So if I open a new window and try to do Istioctl here, you see command not found. So it only works wherever you execute this export command. So let's close it. And there you go. We have downloaded Istio, and now we have Istioctl available. And now as a next step, we're gonna install Istio with this Istioctl command inside our Minikube cluster. So first of all, I'm gonna do get namespace, and let's see that we have just these default namespaces. So no Istio namespace here, and right now also nothing running, right? So we have an empty cluster, and now let's install Istio in our cluster. And we can do that very easily using Istioctl install command. That's it. I'm gonna execute it, and I'm gonna confirm it here. Yes. And everything got successfully installed. We have Istio core, then we have Istiod, which is the main process of Istio or main component, and ingress gateway. So now if I do kubectl get namespace, right here you see Istio system namespace got created, and let's actually check what's inside there. Let's print out the pods. And there you go. We have an Istiod pod running here, as well as Istio ingress gateway. Now, if you already know the Istio Service Mesh architecture, you know that we have this Istiod component, which is the control plane, and we have the data plane, which are basically the proxies that are injected into application pods, right? So if you have a microservice application, you would have pod for each microservice, and then Istio would inject proxy, an Envoy proxy, in each of those microservice pods. So that means in order to see Istio in action and in order to see those Envoy proxies, we need to deploy an application, a microservices application, ideally where the proxies will be injected. So that's going to be our next step. And as an example of microservices, I have found actually one from Google Cloud Platform, Microservices demo project, and we're going to use this one to deploy that in the cluster and then use Istio Service Mesh for these microservices. So in this release folder here, you have Kubernetes manifests, and these are basically Kubernetes configuration files for creating deployments and services for a couple of microservices. So you can clone this repository, and we're going to be using this specific file. I have cloned the repo, and I have that specific file now in this Istio installation folder right here so that I can execute it directly from here. So right now I'm inside Istio folder, and this is my manifests file. So obviously this is just Kubernetes manifest file, so we can do kubectl apply -f and start our microservices. And they will all start in a default namespace. And you see a bunch of them got created. We have deployment and service for each one of those. And now if I do kubectl get pod, again, it's in default. So directly here, you see a list of them, and all of them are getting created. So we're going to wait for this one to initialize and start, and make this smaller so we can see better. And let's do get pod again. And there you go. All the pods are now running, all the microservices. And it took actually around 8 minutes for all of them to come up and get in the running status. So you might have to just wait a little bit for that. And also, I guess because we are deploying all of this in Minikube and because of limited resources, it's also a little bit slower. So I assume in a bigger cluster, this should be a little faster. When you're deploying complex microservice applications in Kubernetes, managing your application data will be challenging. However, Kasten, who is sponsoring this video, has made data management in Kubernetes way easier using its K10 data management platform. K10 basically takes off most of the load of doing backup and restore in Kubernetes from the cluster administrators. It has a very simple UI, so it's super easy to work with, and intelligent logic, which does all the heavy lifting for you. On top of that, Kasten integrates with all major cloud platforms, so you can easily migrate your application from one cluster to another with all of its data. And Kasten does all of that with end-to-end security in mind. You can check them out at kasten.io. Now back to our Istio setup. So now we have our Istio core and we have the microservices running as pods. Now note one thing here, that each microservice has one container inside the pod, right? And you remember I said that Istio should actually inject these proxy containers in each of those pods. So why don't we have two containers inside each pod? Or basically, why don't we have the proxy containers inside? And the reason is because we didn't explicitly tell Istio to inject proxies in the application pods. And it doesn't work by default, right? It doesn't inject proxies into every pod that starts in the cluster. We actually have to configure that specifically. And the configuration for that is actually very simple. What we do is basically we label a namespace with a label called Istio injection enabled. Now, how do we label namespaces? First of all, let's actually see the labels that our namespace has, and we're deploying our applications or microservice applications in a default namespace. So that's the namespace we're going to be labeling. So kubectl get namespace default, and what you can do is show labels. And this will give you a list of labels for a namespace. And actually you can do this, or you can add this show labels option for any other Kubernetes component like pods and services, etc., because all these components can have labels. So default namespace has no labels, and in order to add the label, again, very easy, we do kubectl label namespace default, so name of the namespace basically, and finally we define that specific label. Again, it's a key value pair, and the key is Istio injection, and value is enabled. So this is something that Istio will understand, so we have to name this exactly that. Istio injection enabled, let's execute, and now if I do get or show labels again for our namespace, right here you see that label got added, and you can add as many labels as you want to any component. So now we can actually shut down all these pods, all those microservices, and then recreate them to see the proxies being injected. So we're going to do kubectl delete the manifests. Let's delete all of them. If I do kubectl get pod now, I should see all of them terminating. And now all the pods are gone. We can now just reapply this Kubernetes manifests file like this. And note here that I have actually not done anything to the existing Kubernetes configuration files, right? All we did is basically just label the namespace, and we're doing exactly what we did previously, just apply the Kubernetes manifest file without any modification there, right? And that's the great thing about Istio, that you don't have to reconfigure your existing configuration or the existing Kubernetes configuration files for the proxies to get injected. And now if I do kubectl get pod, instead of one container per pod, you see two containers, which are all initializing. And this will take some time as well. And there you go, all the pods are now running, and this actually took just 2 minutes to start this time. And again, as you see, two containers per pod. And now I'm actually gonna describe one of those pods. Let's take the first one. And in this describe, we're gonna see the containers in that pod. So if we scroll up, right here we have init containers, Istio init, and this is Istio proxy image. And then in the container section, we have our microservices application image itself. So basically this part here, or the init container, got automatically injected in this pod by Istio, because we don't have that container definition inside this Kubernetes manifests file. So if I open this manifest file and search for it, there is no proxy container definition here or init container. So this is done by Istio automatically. So now we have the Istio component running in a cluster that automatically injects the Envoy proxy container into every pod that we create in a default namespace. So we have all that configuration already set up. Now, that's all great, but we don't have any data visualization for what's going on in our microservices, right? So theoretically, if you know Istio, again, I explained that all in detail in this What is Istio section, but Istio actually collects the metrics from all these proxy containers. So you have all these data about how your microservices are performing, what kind of requests they're getting, metrics data, and so on. But we don't see any of this here, right? And this is where Istio Addons come in. And in the Istio official documentation, you actually see this integrations part. And these are add-ons or additional elements that you can install with Istio that will give you all this data visualization about the metrics, tracing, and basically what your microservices are doing and how they are performing. So we're gonna install some of those add-ons in our cluster now. And that is also very simple. So in this Istio folder here, where we have this binary for Istio control or CTL, we have a folder called samples. And inside samples, we have a folder called add-ons. And these are actually just Kubernetes configuration files for those services, right? So the integrations that are listed here for Grafana, Jaeger, Prometheus, etc., we have those files or configuration files for those services in that Istio installation folder. And in order to install them in a cluster, we're gonna apply those Kubernetes YAML files using kubectl apply command in a cluster. Very straightforward. So again, I'm in the Istio installation folder. So from here, I can do kubectl apply. And then in Istio 190, I have samples and add-ons. And I can apply those files one by one, or if I want to apply all the configuration files in the folder, I can do it like this. So execute, and there you go. So you see that a bunch of stuff got created. We have services, deployments, config maps, etc. You actually don't need to understand all those components. What's important now is let's actually clean this up. If I do kubectl get pod from the Istio system namespace where we had 2 pods running, if you remember, and now we have Grafana, Jaeger, Kiali, and Prometheus pods running, or Prometheus is starting up. Let's do it again. And there you go. So now we have those 4 add-ons running as pods in Istio system. And in order to access those pods, obviously we need services. So let's check that as well. Istio system. And we're gonna quickly go through each one of those services that are deployed as Istio add-ons in the cluster. First, we have Grafana and Prometheus. And if you don't know, Prometheus is used for basically monitoring anything in your cluster. This could be the servers itself, memory, CPU usage, as well as Kubernetes components themselves like pods and services and all this stuff. So this is a monitoring tool, and Grafana is a data visualization tool for metrics data. Now, if you want to know more details about Prometheus and Grafana, I actually have a separate video on that, as well as how to deploy Prometheus in your cluster. So you can go ahead and check that out if you want to know more. As a next one, we have Jaeger, collector, and tracing. This is actually a service for tracing microservice requests. Now, if you know how microservices application works, you basically get a request in your application, and then that request goes through multiple microservices, right? So the request basically gets forwarded multiple times, and that creates a chain of requests for one request that a user initiated. And tracing service basically helps you trace that whole chain of requests of microservices from one microservice to another. And with Jaeger, you can then visualize that data, right? You can see those tracing data for those requests, and you can use that to analyze and debug and see where the request basically slows down, etc. So that's tracing. And we also have Zipkin here, which actually is an alternative to Jaeger, right? So in your cluster, when you deploy Istio Addons, you should have just one of those two. And the reason why we have Zipkin here as well is because in this addons folder, we have Grafana, Jaeger, Kiali, Prometheus, but we also have this extras folder, which contains the Zipkin YAML file, right? So that one also got deployed because it's also a Kubernetes configuration file. So we have it here. As well as we have Prometheus operator YAML file in this extras folder, which basically is configuration to monitor the Istio components themselves with Prometheus. And for this to work, you actually have to have Prometheus operator already installed in your cluster, which we don't have in our cluster. Now, again, if you want to know the difference between Prometheus operator and this Prometheus, or what Grafana is, I have own video about that explains all this in detail, so you can go watch that. And finally, we have a service here called Kiali, which is actually my favorite service for working with microservices because it has an amazing data visualization features as well as features to actually configure your microservices setup and communication. So we're going to take a quick look on Kiali and how it looks. And basically, we have all types of visualization, including the monitoring data and the tracing data. Because it's so cool, actually, we're going to take a very quick look at Kiali specifically in our demo. In order to access Kiali, we need access to its service. So I'm going to do kubectl port forward. And this is a service, Kiali, in an Istio system namespace. And as a final parameter for port forward, we need the port of that service. So this will configure port forwarding for this internal service, which we can't access from outside. So I will be able to access it locally, localhost on this port. So let's execute. And that's the address. And let's open it here. And there you go. This is actually Kiali dashboard or view. And we have default namespace and Istio system namespace. And we have 12 applications running in a default namespace. And these are actually our microservice applications. And if I click inside here, I switch to applications and I see basically some data about the applications. But the coolest feature or part is the graph here. If I load this graph, let's actually make the graph bigger. And right here you see the network of our microservices visualized in this form. And Kiali overview and how it works could actually be its own video, but just to give you a very quick idea, you see that just by looking at this graph, even if you have no idea about how those microservices are implemented, you actually see how they communicate with each other, which microservice talks to which one, and so on. And in the service graph, basically you see these are Kubernetes services, basically, that are interconnected. So you see frontend talks to the recommendation service, which talks to the product catalog service, etc. And then per application, as I mentioned, you have metrics and traces and everything also in one place in Kiali. So you have the traffic, inbound metrics, traces, etc. Again, there is much more to Kiali, which could be its own video, but you can definitely just play around with it and check out some features. But there's just one final thing that I want to mention about Istio configuration and how all of this actually works. I mentioned that for Istio configuration, you actually don't need to adjust anything in your Kubernetes configuration files. But there's actually one thing that you need to do, or you need to have in your manifest files for your deployments and services for this graph here to work, or this display here to work. And that is a label called app, right? Right here you see a label app and name of the microservice. And if I search for it, you see all the occurrences. We have them in services and deployments. And app label actually has a special meaning in Istio. So whenever you're deploying your microservices in Istio-enabled cluster, you actually have to have this app label on your deployments and services for the data visualization to work. I mean, the pods will still deploy, you will not have any errors, but the visualization will not work like this, right? And as you see here, the names at service frontend, these actually are the values of app label here. And in the applications tab, also, as you see, we have for each application, these are the deployments basically, you have this app label. So that's how Istio basically knows how to visualize your application graph and the communication like this. So that's the one thing you would probably need to adjust in your Kubernetes configuration files. So that's how you install Istio in your cluster, how you deploy additional add-ons in order to visualize metrics data and communication data between your microservices, and how to configure your cluster for Istio proxy injection. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.